There were some good quotes in that video. One of them says, to worship changes the heart of the worshiper into the image of the one being worshipped. I like that statement. When we're truly in his presence, we change to reflect his image. You know, that's what we're created to do in the first place, right? Is to reflect his image. You ever wonder what it would have been like to be Adam and Eve? To actually walk in the garden and commune with God. To actually walk in the garden and understand what right worship was supposed to look like. To understand what it would mean to be completely in his presence and completely enveloped and completely surrounded and just simply be together with him without any worry of wrong before there was any fall. You ever wondered what that would have been like? And then I have to ask myself, is it possible to have that same relationship now? After the fall? Is it possible for us to come to a place where we can truly worship God? Is it possible for us to come to a place where our approach to worship is so correct that we are surrounded by his presence? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I think we miss it a lot. But I'm pretty sure the answer to that question is yes. But it begs us to ask a few questions. What does worship look like? How do we approach worship? What is worship in the first place? In your bulletins this morning, you've got a handout that you can follow along with me today. And I don't know if you've ever really thought about what worship is. I don't know if you've ever really given it a whole lot of thought other than it's just something we do when we come to church. Well, is it really? Is that where worship starts? Is when we walk in? Is it the second verse of Victory in Jesus? Is it the fourth verse of I'll Fly Away? Is it the latest Chris Tomlin song that gets the heart going? Is it the communion? Is it the prayer time? Is it just coming in and seeing the beauty of the building? Where is it that worship begins? Where is it that we come into his presence and we say, wow, I'm worshiping? Well, I'm going to propose to you this morning, I'm going to challenge you to think about this. That if we wait until we walk into the door of the church to begin worship, we ain't going to get it.
Amen.
We missed it already. Worship doesn't start in a building. Worship doesn't start when we walk in and we kneel at the altar. Worship doesn't start when we walk in the back door and put on our church face. You know, you walk in on game day, you got to put on your game face, right? So we walk in the back door of the church and we put on our church face. Let's go put on our worship clothes. Let's go do our worship thing. If that's where worship starts, we've missed it. We ain't get it. Now, I will tell you this, though. It is our absolute highest priority as Christians to give God all of the glory. To give him the praise and to exalt him by giving him our worship. But what does that look like? How do we do that? Worship is so important to God that of the Ten Commandments. Do you know what the very first commandment deals with? It deals with the subject of worship. You shall have what? No other gods before me. If you have other gods before thee, God, how can you possibly worship him? You can't. This is so important to him that was his first commandment. The Old Testament, they didn't really follow it so well at times. But it was that important. In Exodus 34, he says, do not worship any other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. What does it mean to be jealous? What is it if you're jealous of your wife? You want her and no other. You want her to want you and no other. Think about that. Our God's a jealous God. He wants you to want him and no other God. He wants him to be the desire of your worship, him to be the object of your worship, and no other God. The insinuation there is that while we don't worship any other gods, there is one God, period, who's to be worshipped. And he tells us that all throughout the Bible, all throughout the Old Testament. Abraham worship. You can read it in Genesis chapter 22. It talks specifically about Abraham's worship. Hebrews, it goes back and tells us about some of these guys. It tells us how Jacob worshipped. Tells us how Isaac worshipped. Moses worshipped. I don't know if I saw a burning bush. I don't know if worship really what it would be called. But Moses worshipped. You can read about Joshua and how he worshipped. And of course you can read about David, the psalmist, the king, the little child who grew into an amazing man. He had problems, don't get me wrong, but he worshiped. In fact, David worshiped so much he wanted to create a place of worship. David worshiped so much he wanted worship to be the idol that was worshipped in some ways. You can read about that too. But all throughout the Old Testament, people worshiped. Worship was an integral part of the lives of God's people all throughout the Old Testament. It was so important that God himself designed a temple that was to be a place of worship. It was the first worship center, so to speak. Our worship centers don't look anything like that one did. And it had its reasons, it had its purposes. We'll talk about some of that later. But it was a place that was set up exclusively to worship the one and only God. You go to the New Testament, we find that worship is still important. Jesus told the woman at the well that God is seeking for worshipers. Listen to what he said. This is in John chapter 4. He says, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers," he didn't just say worshipers, he says the true worshipers. I hope I fit in that category. "Will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father is seeking." I wonder what a true worshiper is. Have you ever asked that question? Am I a true worshiper? We might scare ourselves with our answer. That word seek in the New Testament is a Greek word. The word is zeteo, and it literally means to desire. Or to take that a little bit further, it means to demand. Jesus is saying that God demands our worship as true worshipers. So it has to be our highest priority as a Christian to give God all the glory and to give him all the praise and exalt him in our worship. But how do we do that? What exactly is worship? Honestly, have you ever asked yourself that question? Is what I'm doing on Sunday morning really worship? Is what I'm doing in the car when I got the radio cranked up really worship? Is what I'm doing when I read my devotion really worship? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Well, let's dive into this just a little bit. Let's see if we can define, maybe with some help, what worship is by definition and by action. And what our approach to it really needs to be. We're going to spend all of the rest of February talking about worship as we start to build these pillars of what the church is supposed to look like. We've already talked about stewardship, being thankful and faithful in what we've been given. But how do we turn our praise back on the one that gives us all of that? That's what worship is. There's over 400,000 churches in America. What you think about that? Does any one of them have the right picture of worship? Does maybe a fourth of them have the right picture of worship? You ever looked at how many different church looks there are? What different places look like? Some places have pews, some places have chairs, some places have carpet, some places have concrete, some places have gorgeous ceilings, some places have black ceilings, some places have full bands, some places have no instruments. Have you ever wondered who's right and who's wrong? Who's doing it the right way and who's doing it the wrong way? Or all of us doing it kind of the in-between way, which really isn't the way we should be doing it in the first place. We're trying. You ever asked yourself some of those questions? I know I have. But what is it? What does worship look like? Do we have to have a facility to worship in? Do we have to have a hymn book? Do we have to have an overhead projector? What is it? A.W. Tozer defines it pretty well. I like what he says. If you don't know who A.W. Tozer is, or was, he was a theologian from around the turn of the last century. And he defined worship as the missing jewel of the church. Well, wait a minute. Worship's what we do when we go to church, so how can it be the missing jewel of the church? Listen to his explanation. He says, in one of his books that he's written, he says, "Man was given the largest and most sophisticated heart out of all the creatures that God made, but because of sin has taken it and literally thrown it into the mud, and fills his mouth with curses instead of praise to the Creator." Tozer continues on by saying, what is worship? He asks the question, and here's where your quote picks up in your handout. He says, worship is to feel in your heart and express in some appropriate manner a humbling but delightful sense of admiring awe and astonished wonder and overpowering love in the presence of the most ancient mystery, that majesty which philosophers call the first cause, but which we call our Father which art in heaven. Isn't that a pretty cool definition of what worship is? There's a lot of definitions if you go look in the dictionary. you go online and just type in the word worship, you will come up with some crazy stuff. There's one particular definition I like, and it's defined as this: worship is one's heart expression of love, of adoration, and praise to God with an attitude and an acknowledgement of His supremacy and His lordship. This gives us the ability to magnify the Lord with our whole being, with our whole body, with our whole soul, and with our whole spirit. Now, does God really need us to magnify Him? No, He is who He is. We don't make Him who He is. But He demands that our attitude be such that we recognize that and give Him praise for it. Isn't that an interesting concept? Interesting thought. How do we do that? We know that we're called upon to worship. We know that we gather together today as a way to worship the Lord. And I believe that when God's people gather together and they worship together, God does some amazing things. And He blesses that. I really, truly believe that. But here's what I want you to understand this morning. That our worship begins a long time before we ever enter the sanctuary. A long time. Now, corporate worship's important. Don't get me wrong. The early church came together and worshiped together. The historical church in the Old Testament came together and worshiped together. And there were specific directions for worship. Paul gives us specific directions for worshiping together. Corporate worship is important, but it hinges upon each of our individual worship to God on our own and what we do every single day. You know, if there's anything that Satan knows, it's that he can defeat our individual worship. You know, there's a lot of times we come to church hoping that the corporate worship will just take over. But the individual worship is still missing, and we walk out the back doors going, "I just didn't get it today." You ever felt like that? You ever been there before? Oh, I put on my church face, and I opened up the spiritual tank, and it just didn't get filled. I don't know what's going on there. Well, maybe we need to back up before we ever walked into church doors in the first place and see what the individual worship looks like before we start trying to do it corporately. Open with me to Psalms 24. David gives us a picture of what this is supposed to look like. And he outlines it for us, some pretty important aspects of it. Now, a lot of scholars believe that this psalm was written a long time before David had ever captured Jerusalem. A long time before some of those events had happened. But it was David's desire all along to make Jerusalem the religious center and the social center and the political center of God's kingdom. So much so that David wanted to build a temple. We know that God would let him. But it was his desire to create this place, to create a perfect place where God could come in and dwell. And that be his center of worship. That was David's desire. And here David shares with us some conditions, if you will, of what that worship is supposed to look like. And I want to, David's a little bit of an envious guy, if you haven't noticed, in some places. See, the Ark of the Covenant, leading up to this, had been placed in another home, had been placed in another individual's place. If you go back in Samuel, it tells us the story. The Ark had been placed in the house of Obed-Edom. You know, that's one of the names that we probably should name one of our kids today. Ben, you got one on the way. How about putting that name aside? Is that good? You'll pass. He was a Gentile, and the ark had been placed in his house, and the book of Samuel tells us that because the ark was in his house and because worship took place, his house was blessed. That's what David wanted. David wanted his house to be blessed because God's presence was there. So he tried to create this. There was some envy there. David was a little bit jealous there. I don't know that God honors jealousy. Pretty sure that he doesn't. But here, David gives us a picture of what worship is supposed to look like, what our approach to worship should look like. Let's read with me here in Psalm 24. He says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all his people belong to him, for he laid the earth's foundation on the seas and built it on the ocean depths. Who may climb to the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Only those whose hands and hearts are pure, who do not worship idols and never tell lies. They will receive the Lord's blessing and have a right relationship with God their Savior. Such people may seek you and worship in your presence, O God of Jacob. Open up ancient gates, open up ancient doors, and let the King of glory enter. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, invincible in battle. Open up ancient gates, open up ancient doors, and let the King of glory enter. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of heaven's armies. He is the King of glory. How in the world is he giving us a picture of what worship is supposed to look like here? Well, let's see if we can break it apart just a little bit. Jim, if you put the slides back up there, it's the first point in your handout there. Worship has to start. Worship must begin with a right relationship with God. If it doesn't start with a right relationship with God, we're missing the boat altogether. We've got to back up and get some other things right before we can ever enter into a place where we worship. Notice there in verse 3, David asks a question. He says, who can climb the mountain of the Lord? Or who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? The Hebrew word for ascend, the word that some translation use is the word Allah. And that word Allah, it means to go up as if you're going to a meeting, a scheduled meeting. You're going to an appointment. Who is it that can have an appointment with God? Is what he's asking. Who has an appointment with the doctor? You have a need if you have an appointment with the doctor. You're sick. You have a need if you have an appointment with your financial advisor. You need to figure out your retirement funds. You have a need if you have an appointment with a counselor because you need to get something right. Who has a need to have an appointment with God? You ever thought about that? You know, that's what we're doing when we worship, is we're appointing with God. We're coming into his presence because we have a need to tell him, thank you. We have a need to tell him, man, you did it, thanks. Sometimes words don't even express the need that we have when we come to talk to God. But he answers his own question. Who can climb the mountain? Who can ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who may stand in this holy place? And he says in verse 4, only those whose hands and hearts are pure. Only those who have clean hands. Only those who are in a right relationship with God can ascend to an appointment with him. But Pastor, he calls all of us into a place where we ask for forgiveness. Isn't that an appointment with him? Yes. In a way. That's coming to him with a need. That's coming to him with a desire to come to a place where we can come into a right relationship so that we can commune with him, so that we can worship with him. But we can't worship if we don't have that first one right. But we got to get this right. Who can worship with him? Only those that have clean hands. Now, if you've read a lot of the Old Testament or some symbologies in the Old Testament, if you're into that kind of thing, hands and hand postures and hand positions are used a lot in the Old Testament to signify some things. The raising of hands, the lowering of hands, whether palms were open or palms were down, it signified a lot. Coming with a closed fist or an open fist, it meant something. One such example is in Exodus, the priest. When a priest was set apart at the very beginning to be a priest, he was anointed by the order of the priest, and in doing so, they would sacrifice a ram, and they would place blood on his right ear, on his right thumb of his right hand. His right thumb. You only have one thumb on your right hand. On the thumb of his right hand. How about that? Doesn't that look funny? Well, that didn't work. Put blood on the thumb of his right hand. And it also says that they would put thumb on the big toe of his right foot. It was a symbol. It was saying that this priest, in his actions, in his words, in his deeds, in wherever he's at, and whatever he's doing, and whatever he finds himself, in any acquaintance, in any situation, he is set apart as holy, and he better live that way. When we come into a right relationship with God through that initial approach to him, saying, hey, I'm a sinner, and I need to be forgiven, we're set apart and anointed, and we better live that way if we ever want to be in a right relationship to come to a place where we can truly worship. Who can worship? Who can ascend to the hill of that appointment? Only those with clean hands. Only those with a pure heart. David is saying that what we do is important. He's saying that worship is important. All throughout the Old Testament, when we worshiped, it was important. He's saying that the things that we do every day are important. You know, there was a problem in the Old Testament that people would tend to, look at both sides of their mouth. Now, I'm glad we don't have that problem today. Yeah. I'm thankful that we say one thing and absolutely live that way. dealt with in the Old Testament were lying, cheating, saying one thing and doing something else, and building up someone just to cut their legs off and run around. The gossip, the backstabbing, that's nothing new. It's the same thing that the church was dealing with earlier. Do any of those create a right relationship? No. But guess what happens all too often when we walk out the back door of the church, having put on our church face, and go in and play in worship? We walk out the back door, take the church face off, set it in the side or the seat of the car, because we don't have to put it back on until 10 o'clock next Sunday morning, and we go out and we do whatever we want to do the rest of the week, and it's okay. I'm not accusing anybody. So for all I know, maybe talking to myself. But look at the world around us. How many times do you see one thing preached and another thing lived? How many times do you see one thing propagated, but you see the reality of another thing? All around us. Do you think that's being in a right relationship with God? Absolutely not. Do you think he can honor the worship of one that tries to worship him just because they got their worship face on? Same thing that happens in the Old Testament church. Turn over to Malachi for just a second. There's a book that's not preached out of very often. Malachi chapter 3, there's a warning. Malachi is warning of the judgment that's to come. Listen to this in chapter 3 in verse 5. He says, "At the time I will put you on trial. I am eager to witness against all sorcerers and adulterers and liars. I will speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, or who deprive the foreigners living among you of justice. For these people do not fear me, says the Lord of heaven." You know what the promise is to those that say one thing and do another? You know what the promise is to those that profess one thing, but their actions of their life say a completely different thing? The promise is judgment one day. It's not worship. Who can ascend the hill and worship God? Only the one that has one hand. Only the one that has a pure heart. The rest of it leads to judgment. I don't know about you, I'd rather worship. And face the alternative. It's a pretty serious alternative. It's important to understand that what we do, important to understand that our conduct, our actions, our conversations, the things that we say, the jokes that we wind up getting ourselves into, the emails that we don't delete and we wind up reading, the websites we get attached to and can't get away from, the songs that are on the radio, the man's got a cool beat, I don't care what the words say. It's important to realize that every aspect of the way we live our lives, if we're set apart because we're a child of God, we're just like the priest who was anointed and told, you are different, live different. And if we don't, God can't honor that. There's no worship. We put our church face on all we want to, but there's no worship because it can't be honored. Now, David also says that he had a pure heart. Not only is what we do important, not only is our actions important, but the motive behind the actions is equally important. I've seen a lot of people do a lot of good stuff, but not with the right motives, not with the right intentions. Oh, look at me. I just wrote a big tithe check and put it in the offering. I'm going to go cancel that check on Tuesday. Nobody in church will know it. Well, that sounds a little far-fetched, but stuff like that happens. It doesn't have to be with tithes. I'm going to give the church is asking for us to give this. I'm going to give the most. And I want people to see me give the most. You're not doing it to bless the church. You're doing it to build yourself up. It's more than just the action. It's the condition of the heart that leads to the action that creates a right relationship with God. And David warns us, you got to have both. You got to have the clean hands and the pure heart in order to set that appointment with God to worship. Those are dangerous words. And they're words that I think have been watered down in our society. Oh, we just go play church. We'll just turn him on the radio. We'll just watch him online. We'll just touch his hand on the TV and all be good. And, you may think I'm making fun of some things out there. And I don't know, maybe I am. But the reality is it's pretty clear. Have a clean heart, or have clean hands and have a pure heart, and you can have that right relationship. Anything outside of that, and it's not important. Why is that important? Why is understanding that important? Here's why I think it's important. I think, this is my opinion, This is Gregg's Theology 101. Let's not even call it theology, that's a dangerous word. This is Gregg's Opinion 101. There's a lot of things we do in the name of worship that are not worship. There's a lot of things that we do, and it's not all our fault. Some things we've been raised to do in the name of worship. Some things we picked up along the way in the name of worship. But it's not worship. Now, yes, worship probably involves an outward activity. It probably involves something that you see. Probably involves something that others see in you. Raising hands is a form of worship. Raising both hands is a form of worship. Hope your neighbor wore deodorant this morning. Singing hymns is a form of worship. Playing instruments is a form of worship. Other churches view other things, speaking in tongues, some other manifestations, dancing and falling out. All people view those things as manifestations of worship. And yes, there is a reality that there is a visible symbol of worship when things happen. But what's going on inside? What is the motive that leads to that worship is what's important. Because all too often, here's what I think happens. Let's just look at music, for example. I love music. It drives me nuts that I can't sing today. I wish we had a full orchestra and a full praise band and all of the bells and whistles to go along with it, but we don't. But with the motive is correct and the heart is correct and the heart is pure, you don't need all of that to worship. Here's what happens. The music becomes the thing that we worship, not what we're trying to worship through the music. Think about that. The raising hands becomes the thing that I worship because that shows that I'm worshiping. No, it don't. It might. But you know how easy it is to fake that? We can raise our hands till they're numb. We can shout and scream until the rafters fall. We can sing every verse of every song in the hymnal, even the ones that are starred. We always forget, verse 3, the most lonely verse of the Nazarene hymnal. Somebody that play instruments will get that. We can sing every verse, but it doesn't mean we worship. It has to start in the heart. What's the condition of the heart that leads to those things? Are we worshiping the object? Or are we using that object as a symbol of worship? Are we using that to worship? We got to get out of the mindset that it only takes for an hour and a half on Sunday morning, from 10 to, I don't know how long it takes to sing that last song for me to be worshiping. No. Worship's got to start before we ever get here to open the hymn book to sing those songs. It's got to start before we ever tune a guitar or turn a piano on or hit power on the sound system. It's got to start before we ever put a lyric on the screen or a verse on there or print a bulletin. It's got to start before that. It's got to start before we ever pull into the parking lot. We don't even have a reason to be here. Worship is something we do every day. It's that attitude. What was the definition? It's one heart expression of love, of adoration and praise to God with an attitude and an acknowledgement of His supremacy and His lordship. Yeah, it may be manifest in an outward symbol, but it's got to start here with the right relationship. If it's not, we're missing it. If it's not, we need to figure out what this right relationship looks like before we go any further. Let's not hang out there anymore. Let's move on. Second thing, worship must include a respectful reverence. This is a dangerous one. Because I could ask every single one of you what your definition of respectful is, and we're all probably going to have a little bit different definition. How many times have you heard it said that you should, let's see, what's one of those old cliches? This is going to get me in trouble. What's one of those old cliches when you come into the church? You should wear your Sunday best. What does that mean? Does it mean you should wear flip-flops and shorts, or does it mean you should wear a three-piece suit? So whatever your heart says, reverence is where you're at. Doesn't look the same for everybody. But it has to begin with a respectful reverence. Does it bother you when you hear some terms like, and we all use them, we all throw this stuff around, we all say this. Bob and I were talking about this the other day, calling a church the house of the Lord, the house of God. How many of you have used that all your life and never even thought about it? Okay, maybe is this really God's house? This is no more God's house than our house is. This is no more God's house than the funeral home is. This is no more God's house than the gym is. This is no more God's house than Walmart is. Well, there's a holy place. But you know what? If it's a place where he comes into his presence because true worshipers are here, because our hearts are right, and our relationships are right, and we can corporately worship him, then I guess he can be God's house. What about, does this one bother you? When people are talking about God, they call him the man upstairs? Does that bother you? Or instead of saying the Bible, they'll call it the good book. Isn't it funny the things that bother us? You know, we probably should think about those things when we're talking about others. We may be interfering with someone else's worship because we put seeds of doubt in their mind. I'll just curl my own toes here for a minute. But we have to include a respectful reverence for the presence of God. We have to include a respectful reverence for being where he's at. The temple. This is pretty cool when you think about it. If you go back to Exodus, God gives Moses not the temple, the tabernacle. God gives Moses very specific directions on what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. You know, that first worship center? He gives him specific dimensions, specific colors, specific types of materials it's supposed to be built out of. It's supposed to be, just some examples. The north and the south side, there was to be a linen fence. Think about the logic in this. A linen fence of about 150 feet long. We'll call it about because it wasn't feet. In length, and on the east and west side, it was to be about 75 feet in length. It was to be made out of fine twisted linen. The tabernacle is surrounded by a fence of white sheets. How much protection does a fence of sheets give you? What do we usually build a fence for? To keep something out, right? We should build a fence, or to keep a dog in, or keep the kids in. Did we say that? We build a fence for some type of protection. So you get this image of your head of the tabernacle has a fence and it's made out of sheets. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense because the sheet's not going to keep anyone out. You can take a knife and cut through it and you're in. It wasn't designed to keep anyone out. It was designed to remember or to remind those that were in its presence that this is set apart as a holy place. It was built to remind those that if you're inside this tabernacle worshiping, look around you, it's pure. We're not trying to keep you out, but you need to remember when you are in his presence in this tabernacle, you are to be reverent and to be respectful of his presence. God's not trying to keep anyone out. But man, he sure desires our respect and our reverence when we're present with him. Now, don't hear me wrong. Don't hear me saying that the little one that's crying is being disrespectful. Really, you think a baby knows that it's being disrespectful? The little one that wants mama because mama's teaching a class, or you know what I'm saying? That's not disrespect. That's God's creatures being God's creatures. I don't think I have to take that any further. You know what I'm saying? God calls us to be respectful and in reverence when we're in his presence. But I'm going to tell you, if we have that right relationship, and we have the clean hands, and we have the pure heart, you're going to want it. And you know what winds up happening? You don't look at your watch and go, we still got 45 minutes to go. I wish he'd shut up. No, what you wind up doing is you get to the end of the service and you're like, whoa, you showed up today because I came with the right attitude. And you know what that leads to? When you walk out of the church, you don't have to take the church face on because you didn't put on that fake church face to begin with. And you leave here still worshiping. Do you know what people see? If God's people worship changes the image of the worshiper to look like the one that's worshipped. You want to be a testimony to people? Let them see you worship and you don't even realize you're doing it. They're going to know something's up and they're going to want to know, or they're going to run the other direction because they can't stand the sight of it. That's okay too. But when we come into his presence with the right relationship, with a reverence of who he is, what he is in our life, oh my goodness, amazing things can happen. But you know what Satan does? He's good at this. He's very good at this. Come on, Pastor, if you wrap this up when you meet the crowd of Romans. Man, I got to get that report done this afternoon because it's due in the morning. I got to meet the kids this afternoon. What time am I supposed to be there? Satan knows how to work with our mind. He knows how to work and get us thinking thoughts that we don't need to be thinking. But I'm convinced if we're truly in God's presence because we have the right relationship, we can separate ourselves from all those other things because they still matter. To be in His presence, is there a greater thing? You can starve all day and you never know it. Romans can close and open again tomorrow, and you'll still be okay. To be in His presence, there's nothing greater. Let's move on. The third thing. We have to have the right relationship. We must include a proper reverence. But we also have to offer a relevant response. What does that mean? What does it mean to offer a relevant response? Just a chapter back, David writes in Psalm 22, he says, "Be holy, that thou art holy, the one that inhabits the praises of Israel." How can being in the presence of God not demand a proper response? How can being in His presence not lead you to respond to that? You ever been in a church service where you're just like, whoa? I remember some services when I was a kid growing up. Anybody remember the White Hanky Society? You know what I'm talking about. I remember some of the ladies in the church would scare me to death when they would get out of the aisles and start running and the handkerchiefs would start going. I'm like, what would you do if you left your handkerchief at home? Could you still worship? But you know what? When you're in His presence, when we're reverent in His presence and we have the right relationship, you never know what the response is going to be. We may do some things and others look at us as being silly, and it's okay. It's in God's presence, Who cares? We may sing and not be able to sing. That's okay. It's in God's presence, Who cares? Probably an amen or two out there to some that have heard that. Look at verses 7 through 10. He changes directions. It says something a little strange. Open up ancient gates, open up ancient doors, and let the King of Glory enter. What does that mean? Open up ancient gates, open up ancient doors. Well, let's change some words a little bit. Play with some words. Open up your hearts and let, not the doors, let your body be receptive. You're the temple. Your heart's the door. We're the ones that respond, not a building, not a tabernacle, not a temple. It's us. What does that response look like? You're not going to believe we're going here, but we're going to do it. Turn over to the Song of Solomon. If you've ever read that verse, you're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with worship? If you've ever read this book, there's a warning here. Have you ever walked away from church on a Sunday morning or a Sunday night or a revival service and you walk away and you're like, man, you know, so-and-so really seemed like they got into the service tonight. I just didn't get it. I tried, and I thought I was responding, but I just feel empty. You ever walked away from a service feeling like that? Just kind of dejected, kind of let down? It all goes back to that right relationship thing. It all goes back to the response. It all goes back to the reverence. Maybe there's something getting in the way of that relationship, but this is it's a picture of a bride in Solomon, the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, whichever some translations call it different. It's a picture of a bride who has already retired for the night. She's already got her bed clothes on. She's already washed her feet and is in bed. And the bridegroom comes and knocks on the door. And she sort of debates whether to get up and go let him in. And when she gets to the door, he's gone. When she finally decides, okay, I'll get up and I'll let you in, he's gone. Here's the deal, and I think this happens a lot. When God knocks on our door, on our heart to let him in so that we can worship, if we don't respond, it's gone. If we don't respond, we missed it. Now, we'll get opportunity again later, hopefully. But it's just like Jesus telling the guy that had the father that he needed to bury. I'd love to follow you, but I gotta go bury the dead first. I'd love to follow you, but I gotta go tend to the field. I'd love to follow you, but I got all these riches. If God knocks and we say anything but, okay, well, give me just a minute, it's over, it's done. When he's present and he demands the worship of us, if there's not a response, we miss it. Read the story in chapter 5, I think it is. Look at start at verse 2. I slept, but my heart was awake. When I heard my lover knocking and calling, open to me, my treasure, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night. When I responded, I've taken off my robe, should I get dressed again? I've washed my feet, should I get them soiled? My lover tried to unlatch the door, and my heart thrilled within me. I jumped up to open the door of my love, and my hands dripped with perfume. My fingers dripped with lovely myrrh as I pulled back the bolt. I opened the door, and he was gone. My heart sank. I searched for him, but could not find him anywhere. I called to him, but there was no reply. What the story is telling you there is that when she got to the door, because of her hesitation, he was gone, and all that was left was his fragrance. All that was left was the evidence of his presence, but he wasn't there. I hate the thought of the fact that someone could walk away from a church service, could walk away from any encounter with God's presence, and all they walked away from was the smell of his presence. All they walked away from was the reality that he was there and I missed him. All they can walk away from that service with is that, oops, I hesitated and I missed him. God's presence demands a relevant response from us. His worship, our worship of him, demands that relevant response. But it's got to go back to the right relationship. So let me ask you a question this morning. What's your approach look like? What's your approach to worship look like? How's your approach today? Lois, there's a song we used to sing. I don't know if you have it or if you remember it. It's called Give Us Clean Hands. If you don't worry about it. But if you have it, sorry, it's kind of spurred at the moment. Jim, can you see if we have the words to that song? Look at there. I want to offer you an invitation this morning to get in that right relationship. I want to offer you an invitation this morning to explore what it looks like to have that reverence in his presence, to explore what it looks like to have a relevant response. Maybe you're wondering, I can't remember the last time I had that encounter, Pastor. I just don't remember it. Maybe you know what it is that's keeping you from having the clean hands, keeping you from having the pure heart. I'm actually stand with you this morning. What is it that gives us the clean hands? What is it that gives us the pure heart? What is it that gives us that right relationship? God demanded our worship so much that he paid for it for us. He sent his son down the cross so that we can have that right relationship. And I want to write back heads. I want you to be honest with yourself this morning. I want you to ask yourself, maybe it's been a long time since you thought about this. Maybe it's been tearing you up. I don't know. Do you have that right relationship today? You know, we can talk about worship until we're blue in the face. We can sing songs until we start writing verses. If we don't have the right relationship, it's pointless. And I just want to ask you the question this morning. Do you have the right relationship? Do you need the right relationship? And if your answer to those questions is no, I don't have that relationship, and yes, I do need it, I want to give you the opportunity to come this morning and invite the one that gave you the opportunity into your life and into your heart. That's a simple process. God, I'm not worthy. Thank you for sending your son. I just wonder, might there be one that's that way? I'll attempt to lead us in a verse of it. that's you, would you come this morning? We bow our hearts, we bend our knees. Oh Spirit, come make us humble. We turn our eyes from evil things. Oh Lord, we cast out our idols. Give us clean hands, give us pure hearts. Let us not lift our souls to another. Give us clean hands, give us pure hearts. Let us not lift our souls to another. And God, let us be a generation that seeks your face, oh God of Jacob. God, let us be a generation that seeks your face, oh God of Jacob. I want to give you a chance to do something else. Maybe you're not questioning the relationship this morning. Maybe you're not questioning whether you're a blood-bought, born-again child of His. But we haven't quite figured out that set-apart thing. We haven't quite figured out that be different thing. We haven't quite figured out that when I walk out of the church on Sunday morning, I'm taking off my church face. I need to go out and live different. I need to go out and be different. That's you this morning. I'm just going to ask Lois to play for a minute. Give you an opportunity to respond.